Brilliant. Thanks so much. So I'm Dylan Connor. I'm a very recent associate professor at Arizona State University. And the question we're tackling today is who is being left behind by left behind places? So this paper is a collaboration between myself, Tom Kemeny at the University of Toronto, Alec Berg, who's a graduate student at ASU and also on the call at the moment, and Peter Kedron, who's a professor at ASU too. So the key issues we're really dealing with here is the question of who's been left behind by left behind places, and tackling this question of whether left behind places have particularly strong impacts in limiting the life chances of children who are born into poverty and growing up in these contexts. So the key concept we're really focused on here is social mobility, and we're thinking about that as the adult income levels of children born to parents at the lower end of the income distribution, or the 25th percentile. And so what I'm going to present today is our study of social mobility across around 20,000 places in the US over the period from 1980 up to 2018. And what we're really focused on is the effect of left behind contexts on social mobility, also segmented by location, race, ethnicity, and gender. So this work is emerging from a trajectory of projects that I've been doing over a couple of years with a variety of different collaborators focused on the changing geography of opportunity and social mobility in the United States. And one of the big papers in this line is the work I did with Michael Storper, which we published in PNAS, which was basically a century-long analysis of social mobility outcomes across the US, and looking at how structural economic change was bringing about differences or changes in local intergenerational mobility and inequality. And so the work you're going to see today is really in that vein of thinking about how places are changing, how places are being left behind, and what kind of downstream impacts those changes are having for the kids growing up in those communities. So the way we think about this in a very kind of simple conceptual model type way is, let's say we're interested in the life chances of children growing up in a particular context. We can think about those life chances from the perspective of income, education, where people live, their demographic behaviors and outcomes. And the traditional way of thinking about those outcomes is through the perspective of households or families, or from a very kind of household personal perspective. And you can think about those household conditions as being related to income, racial or ethnic composition, gender effects on the kids. And what we're really doing here is we're joining as part of a wave in social science of thinking about how community conditions or place effects might interact with these household conditions to shape the life chances of individuals growing up in a particular place. And so what's really key here in terms of what we're doing is we're not just thinking about these left behind places based on one snapshot in time. What we're really actually trying to characterize is the trajectory on which places are on, and how those trajectories interact with these household or personal effects to produce differences in life chances across places. So we can really think about it as an interaction between people and places. So what we're doing here and what we need to do is actually construct a database that will allow us to study places and their changes over time, and how those outcomes relate to social mobility. So what we're effectively working with are two separate databases that we are working on joining together. We have a database that I developed with my collaborators in an NIH-funded project, which tracks 20,000 places, which we observe in 1980, 90, 2000, 2010, and 2018. And we observe a lot of characteristics for these places. And then to that database, we join recently constructed and really powerful social mobility estimates being produced by Raj Chetty's team at Opportunity Insights, which track the intergenerational outcomes of kids across the United States over the period from roughly 1980 to 2015. These estimates are based on millions of tax records. And really what we're looking at are kids born into low-income households in the 1980s and 1990s, and where they end up in the income distribution later on. So When it comes to studying how those outcomes might relate to left behind places, the first task that we have on our hands is actually trying to characterize which places might be considered to be left behind. And so we're approaching this really from four domains: the poverty rate of the place, its average income levels, its educational attainment, and its unemployment rate. And so what we do is we take each place and we rank it across these four domains at the beginning of our time period in 1980 and 90, and at the end of our time period in 2010/2018. And we consider a place to be left behind if it's in the bottom 20% on 3 out of 4 of those indicators. So 3 out of 4 of poverty, income, education, or unemployment. So if you're in the bottom fifth across time on one of those indicators, we consider you to be left behind as a place. So what I'm going to show now are some quick descriptives, what we're seeing in the data between these different categories of places and social mobility, and where we're pushing right now at the moment is in trying to model some of these effects and approach them from a more spatial econometric perspective. So we have a beginning period in which we classify places, and we have an end period in which we classify places as left behind. And that really leads us to 4 distinct categories, 2 of which we're really focused on in this left behind, from this left behind perspective. So we have places, around 8.5% of places are in that bottom fifth in the 1980 period, and also at the end of the series. And we call these long-term left behind places. And these places have been left behind over long periods of US history. But we also have this really interesting group, which are not left behind in 1980, but are by the end of our series. And these places really seem to be those that are being hit particularly hard by recent regional and structural economic change across the US. And so what we're doing then is we're contrasting these left behind places with places which have never been left behind under our criteria, or which were left behind at the beginning of our series, and which later moved out of that category and moved up the income hierarchy of places in the US. Okay, so let me give you a couple of snapshots of what we're seeing in the data. The light pink areas on this map are places that are in the long-term left behind category. These places seem to be really highly concentrated in the US South. These places, many of which have had low levels of income and educational attainment and high poverty for a very long period of time. And that's really the geography of the long-term left behind places is really concentrated in the South. What's really interesting is that the places that are much more recently left behind tend to pop up in more recently deindustrializing places, or places that have been hit hard by recent changes, relatively recent changes in the global economy. And so we have these different geographies of left behind places that we're interested in. We're seeing big differences within cities. So Detroit, for example, has very large areas of the city which are in this kind of recently left behind trajectory. LA has much less left behindness in general, but also does have pockets of these different categories, which we're starting to dig into and start trying to better understand what's going on in these places. Okay, so to get to the social mobility side of it, and I'm just gonna talk through the descriptives that we have at the moment and what we're seeing. So our goal is to look at these 4 categories and look at how children growing up in similar households in economic terms are faring differently across these different categories of places. And so we have a range of income-based outcomes, different subgroups, and different migration outcomes. And so we have, just to take a quick snapshot, we have all children, we have a female-only group, we have a Black and Hispanic-only group, and then we have a range of migration outcomes. And so we don't have time to go through and navigate this table, but what I'm going to do is quickly summarize some of the kind of bigger patterns that we're seeing across our left behind categories of places. So what we're seeing is, in general, we're seeing lower social mobility across left behind places, whether they're long-term left behind or more recently left behind. But what's also really intriguing on top of that is that we're also seeing much lower rates of out-migration, particularly among the recently left behind. So not only are people, not only is economic opportunity being limited in these places, but people also seem to be more reluctant to leave them to move to other places, which is a particularly concerning fact, which I'll touch on in just a moment. We're also seeing, in terms of social mobility, the recently left behind places actually seem to be converging on the levels, the social mobility levels of the long-term left behind places. And so there seems to be some kind of convergence process going on among the left behind. And we're also seeing that for women and minorities, we generally see that those groups or those subsets fare worse in terms of social mobility across the board. But when it comes to the particular effects of left behindness or growing up in a left behind place, we actually see the strongest effects on white men. So the variance in outcomes for women and these minority populations is actually smaller across the different categories of places, but it's actually largest for the white men, who on average are actually doing, of course, doing better, but we see more range in their outcomes across the different categories of places. And so what these results are, these preliminary results are pointing to, is that these left behind contexts seem to be having potentially self-reinforcing effects. So we're seeing this economic hardship in these places. This is having a downstream effect on social mobility outcomes in these places. And those people are not moving elsewhere to escape those conditions in the same rates as they are, as people in other places are moving elsewhere. So we kind of have this self-reinforcing compounding effect, which looks likely to persist across generations. So we're seeing these strong intergenerational effects. And so ignoring these left behind places or trying to let them take care of themselves looks like a pessimistic strategy in terms of trying to think about the long-term view of this issue and where it's going. So let me just wrap up by pointing to two kind of big conversations that are going on in the US at the moment. One is particularly thinking about rural places, but also left behind urban places. One suggestion is that in terms of America's forgotten places, there's a conversation coming around of whether these places can be saved or whether people should just leave. Okay, so thinking about this really as, should we pursue place-based policy or should we pursue people-based policy? And what we've seen under the Biden administration is a kind of a real ramping up, or at least that the good intentions of pushing toward more place-based policy. And what our work is starting to suggest is that given these self-reinforcing effects on social mobility, these relatively low rates of out-migration from these struggling contexts, people-based policy seems unlikely to be an effective solution to these low rates of social mobility we're seeing across left behind places, which means that this strategy of generating investment and creating opportunity locally really seems to be the most likely strategy to try and deal with these low rates of social mobility and high rates of intergenerational inequality across these left behind contexts. So I'll leave it there, and we really welcome any feedback or questions or thoughts as we start to push this analysis more into the modeling phase and the spatial econometric next phase of the work.